This program is brought to you by Preserve Gold, the #1 precious metals IRA provider. Call 855-962-3322.
Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Faisal Saeed Al Mutar, founder of global nonprofit Ideas Beyond Borders, on what China's growing presence in the Middle East means, not just for the U.S., but the world. Al Mutar had his own journey to America. 20 years ago, he witnessed U.S. tanks roll down the streets of Baghdad when he was 12. A few weeks later, Saddam's statue toppled. He survived the Iraq Civil War, the tragic murder of his older brother, and multiple kidnapping attempts before becoming a refugee in the U.S. in 2013. He's since worked to counter extremism and misinformation on a global scale for several decades. Faisal Saeed Al Mutar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to zoom in. There seems to be a lot of growing Chinese presence in the Middle East. We saw recently Saudi Arabia and Iran brokering this deal that was actually kind of struck by China. And so what do you make of China's growing presence? What does China care so much about the Middle East?
One of the main things that I'm scared about China is the selling of surveillance technology to countries around the Middle East. So we might be waking up in a near future where it will become very difficult to communicate ideas to people in the Middle East because of the fact that Chinese censorship tools are very advanced, and many autocrats in the region love them. So we might be, within this decade or coming decade, we might be faced with Egypt that has a firewall, and Saudi Arabia that has a social credit system. So that makes it very difficult for my organization, which is about making ideas accessible about democracy and human rights to the people in the Middle East, almost impossible. So that may be something that, because that's something that affects really roughly 300 million people who live. And Iran just a couple days ago announced that now they're using artificial intelligence to track women without a headscarf. And it is very likely that it was Chinese technology that they got that has that capacity. So these are the kind of what I think for, because many people ask these questions like, oh, so what? Like what would China do if they expand to the Middle East? Well, this is what the type of things that they're selling. They're not opening a McDonald's and a Starbucks in each corner. They're selling surveillance technology. So that's maybe like something that really could affect media worldwide, is that having the ability not to be able to speak to people in the Middle East directly because of how tight the internet can become within these countries. If you think that that's something that your audience may be interested in, I mean that's something that I have also a lot of expertise on, as someone who actually works in spreading circumvention tools for people around the Middle East. The Middle East has always been a battlefield between multiple countries around the world. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union used to translate materials of communism and spread them all across the Middle East. Prior to that, the era between World War I and World War II, and the fact that whenever you go walk in the streets of Jordan, streets of Beirut, and other countries, you see the books of Mein Kampf in many libraries, is that the fact that the Middle East, because of its resources and because of its kind of influence, it's always generally been a battlefield, and it is one of the forefronts right now for China to expand its influence. Unfortunately, China has a very positive reputation across the Middle East due to the fact that it doesn't have what some people consider a hostile history, like countries in Europe or the United States in particular. So that's how they're kind of portraying themselves to the region, is that we are a peaceful broker that tries to we're not trying to interfere in your culture. We are just here to make everybody get along. And for many of the aristocrats, they love it. I mean, the Chinese are telling them, well, we kill our journalists too, so you can do whatever you want. So they're selling this kind of package in which there is limited intervention. Most of it is just focused on economics. Well, the devil is in the details in terms of selling their surveillance technology, trying to utilize a lot of the resources within the Middle East. I mean, Saudi Arabia is I believe, one of the biggest sellers of oil to China. And the same fact that they have a deal with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is something very rare that America does not have, and so is other countries. So they're trying to kind of, I was not necessarily impose their influence, but really utilize it to create more dominance in the region and compete with the United States.
And you mentioned the devil's in the details, right? And that China's selling this basically surveillance technology there. So how do you see that playing out in the countries in the Middle East?
It's already playing out in many different ways. I mean, the first country that really signed up surveillance technology with China is Egypt. And over the past couple of years, we've seen very limited presence of civil society. A lot of people, activists or dissidents within these countries are arrested due to the fact that the government now has better tracking. They're able to really intercept a lot of the communications to stop any form of political opposition. So we have seen some of that already in play. As of last week, Iran has imposed an artificial intelligence technology to track many of the protesters, mainly women protesters who are not wearing a headscarf. So that's a more recent example, and I see that more and more coming. So what China already has inside China, from social credit system to advanced tracking and what's sometimes called the Chinese firewall, we can easily see it being applied heavily in the Middle East. And for people in the Middle East, it means they will be less likely to listen or be familiar with ideas happening in the outside world, which is exactly what many of the regimes there want. And for many countries in free societies, they will have extreme difficulty of communicating their ideas directly to the people of the region. So that I can definitely see that happening within the next couple decades, really, in which most of all the channels that the U.S. government has, for example, the Voice of America or the equivalent of it, the Middle East Broadcasting Network or the BBC and other places, it will be harder and harder for these ideas to be able to get to the people there. And while the only ideas available are the ones that the Chinese government wants or their allies in the Middle East have. So that's really, I think, what can really be applied. And I think that's something that's really scary and not many people are talking about.
I want to zoom in on that. So who's benefiting from this censorship and this surveillance? Who's the ultimate benefiter here?
The aristocrats in the region, who many of them, I mean, one of the things that they see as threatening about the United States in both true and not true ways is that the United States, in a way, just the fact of them spreading their culture, or at least even things like music and other than that, it leads to people's liberation. It leads people to be able to be critical of authority. It leads people to, when you see American television, you see people making fun of their government. You see people criticizing their government. Many of these kind of bespoke messages, the things that are not really direct, have an effect on populations at large. I mean, that was kind of part of the inspirations was behind the Arab Spring, is that people see YouTube and see videos around the world of how life is outside. And that is something that's kind of reducing more and more as many of these technologies are being implemented. So really the people who benefits the most are the aristocrats in the region and the authoritarians. And that is the kind of the version that China is selling, is that on one hand you can control your people with their surveillance technology, and you can copy what they call kind of the Chinese model, which is a version of kind of advanced capitalistic authoritarianism, in which people are not, all of them are starving to death. They can still have their car and they can still buy their Louis Vuitton, and at the same time be under the control of the state, and the state be able to control not necessarily the means of production, but really all people's movements and ideas.
And on that note, you mentioned earlier the amount of resources in this region. So what does it mean that China seems to be having the most access to that? How does that help China?
I mean, Saudi Arabia, Middle East is kind of a large place, but the Gulf states, they represent one of the largest producers of oil and natural gas. So that's really kind of the biggest selling point. One of the other things that they are trying to do is diversifying their economy away from oil. And Chinese companies are offering the fact that these countries become investors in Chinese companies. So in that way, the Gulf states diversify their economy, and the Chinese benefit from a lot of the wealth. I mean, many of these countries right now, because of the Russia war on Ukraine, have benefited a lot. The fact of the rising oil prices have put Saudi and many countries on a surplus. Which is something very different than most of the world, which is struggling because of the restrictions and the kind of return of the economy. These countries are having a lot of surplus. So in ways that it is the best place to invest in at the moment. And the Chinese are seeing a great opportunity in which they can divert the funds and that surplus away from these countries buying weapons from the West or buying technology from the West, but rather divert the money into China and the Chinese companies.
That was Faisal Saeed Al Mutar, founder of global nonprofit Ideas Beyond Borders. And after a break, we continue our coverage with him on what culture means, especially when those in power want to control it or wipe it out. Our full episode is available on our partner platform, Epoch TV. To subscribe, click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.